So, we will start with our second topic and this is where we are getting into the basics of the physical and mathematical foundations which are required for simulating these flows. So, we have talked about physiology and how physiology connects to the physical situations, and then the physics will translate to maths. So, that is where a qualitative understanding gets into quantitative understanding. So, the qualitative understanding or the central physics that we will bother about for all the topics which are going to be discussed here is the principle of conservation. So, conservation is something which from our very basic school level understanding we realize conservation of mass, conservation of energy and so on, and these principles are basic physical principles. We will see that in a problem where we are talking about transport phenomena. Transport phenomena means that something is being transported or something is moving. So, that transport may be transport of mass, transport of momentum, transport of energy, whatever, and the transport is typically governed by a conservation law. So, that central physics we will try to understand, and our objective would be that based on that understanding we will generalize it, number one, and we will apply the generalized understanding to develop the mathematical foundation for the simulations. So, to do that what I will talk about first is that where fluid mechanics is different in terms of its mathematical and physical description. The mechanics as a terminology is something, again from our school level understanding we know that the classical mechanics with which as engineers we are bothered about, and even in physiological systems that classical mechanics is what we are talking about. We are not talking about quantum mechanics in the examples that we are going to cover. So, in the mechanics paradigm we have the Newton's laws, and the Newton's laws are still the most classical foundations, and we all are familiar with the statements and the meanings of the Newton's 3 laws of motion. The question is, if we are familiar, and why can't we straight away apply that for whatever problems we are going to address, be it physiology or any other application. Now, the challenge is that the Newton's laws which we have all studied in the form which is commonly described in school level or college level texts, they are talking about something which is called as a control mass system. It is not directly telling that it is about a control mass system, but what it is doing is it is trying to give a statement which applies to a particular identified mass, which is a control mass system by nomenclature. So, it is either you can consider it as a material body or maybe a identified mass which has many particles, etc. So, Newton's first law, second law, third law, all are described on the basis of that. If you imagine a fluid will of course be described, or we can describe fluid by such material concepts or particles, but it is impossible practically to track all such material entities because the fluid is continuously flowing and deforming. So, instead of tracking such control mass as it is moving, it is much more convenient to focus your attention on a specific location. That specific location itself be movable, it is not that it has to be fixed, but a specified location, and your entire observation is around that focus. So, as if you are sitting with a camera and you have a focus at a particular location and you are studying what is the change that is taking place around that. So, this is what is the control volume approach. So, control volume is that specified region where you are studying what is happening, across which you are studying what is happening. So, your focus is not on identified mass, but identified region, that is the fundamental difference. So, to give an example, so this is like a river and someone is interested to study the movement of water in the river as this boat is going along. So, one particular approach is that there is someone who is sitting or standing on the boat, and that person is trying to understand the water flow with respect to what is seen from the boat. Now, there may be an identified set of say fluid particles which are closely moving with the boat, that means the boat is like pushing them, and this person, I mean as a drama we can name this person as Mr. Lagrange. So, what Mr. Lagrange is doing is measuring the temperature there. Now, another person who is not working that hard, but trying to do similar measurements is standing on the bridge and trying to measure maybe the temperature, if not the water temperature or maybe atmospheric temperature, does not make much of a difference so far what concept we are talking about. So, that person is also trying to measure maybe temperature or velocity whatever, but sitting at a or standing at a fixed place and focusing the attention maybe just down in the bridge and seeing that what change is happening there, and that change is recorded by that thermometer which Mr. Euler is carrying. So, at that location Mr. Euler is recording the change in temperature, whereas Mr. Lagrange is not tracking the change at that location. So, there is some fluid which is moving, Mr. Lagrange is following that with the help of the boat, and therefore, Mr. Lagrange's thermometer is reflecting that change. So, Mr. Lagrange is the follower of the control mass concept, whereas Mr. Euler is the follower of the control volume concept, that means an identified region. But at the end your answer of say you want to know that what is the temperature at a particular location, whether Mr. Lagrange measures it or Mr. Euler measures it, the method may be different, but the answer should be same. At a location you cannot have two different temperatures. So, ideally what will happen is that when Mr. Lagrange is moving just below the bridge, whatever Mr. Lagrange is measuring, Mr. Euler is also measuring. So, when that control mass is coinciding with the location of the control volume, then their measurements are the same. So, Mr. Lagrange's way of describing this motion is called as Lagrangian, and Mr. Euler's way of describing this motion is called as Eulerian. And the Eulerian approach, which is based on the control volume, is more convenient for the fluid, but we do not have Newton's laws directly defined for Eulerian. We have Newton's laws directly described for Eulerian. So, we will use the Newton's laws say when we are talking about motion, but at the same time we will recognize that when they are coinciding, then whatever is there for the control mass, the same description is there for the control volume. So, in that way we can merge them when they are coincident. Now, control volume being a conceptually straightforward way to describe the physical system where something is flowing. So, we have this as a box which is a conceptual control volume, and many times whenever we are dealing with such topics, this is what we draw to explain what is happening. So, in the control volume something is entering say mass, momentum, energy, with fluid is flowing, through that it is entering, or simply by diffusion it is entering. Something is leaving, which is the output, and something may be generated. For example, it may be a heat transfer system where heat enters and leaves by conduction, but there is a electrical wire where current is flowing and joule heating is produced. So, that is this generation. Generation conceptually can also be absorption if it is instead of heating, cooling. So, at the end, what is the change? If you want to now write a balance, something has gone in and something is leaving. So, ideally the change is whatever has gone in minus whatever has gone out, but there is also something generated. So, inside the control volume, the net change is what? Whatever has come in minus whatever has gone out plus whatever is generated, that is the net change inside the control volume. So, this is the very basic, it reads very simple, but all the most complex control volume based foundations are essentially based on this simple concept. It is just how you mathematically put this in the language of mathematics. Now, when we talk about conservation, mass is conserved, momentum is conserved, energy is conserved. In a reactive system, chemical species they are conserved, electrical charge may be conserved. So, the whole idea is that the physics which is talking about a conservation principle, the conservation principle can be applied across the physical phenomena. But because the conservation principle is the same, no matter whether it is mass, momentum, energy, etc. So, the wish or the expectation is that if we develop a common mathematical foundation which is talking about the conservation, then that mathematical foundation should apply for all these conservation principles. And why we are trying to do that? Because if we can come up with such a mathematical foundation and if we know how to simulate those in a computer, then that common general approach can be applied across the physical problems, and then what we have is a generic code, computer code, which we can apply depending on the physical problem, whereas the algorithm remains the same. So, how do we mathematically quantify that? So, let us say this phi, which is written as a function of position and time. So, position is given by 3 coordinates x1, x2, x3, which is like x, y, z, and you have time, and the total property is integral of phi over the volume, which is the volume that you are considering. Now, we are trying to introduce something which is the total change of this phi. So, what is this total change? Let me try to sort of draw a picture to understand. So, let us say that there is a direction in which some element of fluid is flowing. So, you have a packet of mass, something like this. So, this packet of mass is moving from one location to the other along this line. So, after some time this packet of mass comes here. Okay. So, when the packet of mass from here to here has come, it will be subjected to a change in velocity. The change in velocity will be due to two things. Number one, that even if this packet was staying here, its velocity would have changed with time. That means, had its position been fixed, but the velocity would change with time. So, this velocity is described by the velocity at a given location. So, we are talking about, say for example, velocity which is a function of the position and the time. So, this is the Eulerian description. So, this phi what we have written here is a Eulerian description. For example, it is velocity. So, this is not the velocity of a particle or some mass. So, if this at a given location changes with time, then even if the location is fixed, you will have a change in velocity. So, how do you quantify that? You quantify by that by the time derivative of velocity at a given location. But even if it does not change at this location with time, it goes to a new place, and at that new place you will have a new velocity, because your x has changed and even time has also changed. So, both x and time they have changed. So, in that way you have a velocity component which, even if the time was fixed, say at the same time you would have two different velocities, because you have the change in position. So, you have say velocity as a function of position and it can change. So, what is the cumulative effect? Cumulative effect is that you have a total change from here to here because of a change due to change in time, even if the position would have not changed, and the other because of the change in position, a new point will have a new velocity, even if things are not changing with time. So, if we are talking about now the rate of change of velocity, which is acceleration. Now, acceleration is the rate of change of velocity with respect to that Lagrangian description, that you have some particle, its rate of change of velocity is acceleration. Now, what we see that if we describe that same concept with Eulerian variables, then the change is due to the time dependent change and position dependent change of an Eulerian variable. So, to bring this Eulerian variable based description in a Lagrangian calculation, we are introducing this total derivative, which is capital D dt. So, its objective is that the physical description is Lagrangian. That means, we are trying to create trying to talk about the rate of change of velocity of a particle, but that velocity we are not describing by the Lagrangian way, we are describing that velocity by Eulerian way, and that is why it is not that simple d dt that we are talking about. We can write this, but then this is Eulerian variable and this is Lagrangian variable. Okay. So, that is what we are trying to see the change, because there is a change as there is fluid is entering and leaving the control volume. So, the change is this given by this d dt of this total phi, and this change is nothing but what? This change is in minus out, okay. And also this change, so if you imagine there is a control volume, so this overall thing is in minus out plus a change with respect to time, which is the rate of change inside the control volume. So, all these are accounted for by what? So, if you see that conservation principle. So, you have in minus out and then you take the rate of change also on the same side. So, these all together are related to the generation. If you write, just bring them from one side to the other. So, in that way, if psi is the generation per unit volume, then this total change is related to the psi, which is this total change includes the change with respect to time and position. So, inflow minus outflow plus rate of change within the control volume. So, that is mathematically formalized in this way. Now, this is physical. Let us say now you do not understand anything physical and you are doing the mathematics of partial differentials. So, you have phi, which is the variable, dependent variable is a function of x1, x2, x3 and time. So, if in the simple calculus nomenclature you write, so I am just cleaning it up to write it. if you are now writing it in a simple calculus nomenclature, so you have d phi, so you have phi as a function of x1, x2, x3 and time. So, you have the total change is sum total of the partial changes. So, that is what this is the basic rule of the partial derivatives. So, that is what we have used, but we have to be careful in the sense that the description is not the Lagrangian, but the Eulerian. So, when we describe it to emphasize it symbolically, we will use the capital D. So, now if you are finding out the rate of change with respect to time, so this will become dx1 dt. So, as if you are doing the ordinary derivative. So, we have to remember that it is not like dividing, it looks like dividing, but d dt or d dx whatever, it is an operator. But why I am writing straightforward in this way, that as if you have written delta x1 by delta t and taken the limit as that tends to 0, so that it becomes like this. So, it is just a short way of writing the same thing, but when you have delta x1 divided by delta t, it remains a division, but when you take the limit, it becomes an operation d dt, that you have to keep in mind. So, now this is what? This is the rate of change of x1 with respect to time. So, if you are now describing it as a follower particle, so that cuboid type of thing which is a follower particle which is moving. So, if it is the description of a follower particle, this is its x component of velocity, x1 component of velocity. So, let us say this is u of the particle along 1 along x1, this is u of the particle along 2 and this is u of the particle along 3. Okay. Now, the particle that we are talking about is not any physical particle, it is just a conceptual particle which is neutrally buoyant with the flow. That means, it is neutral with the flow, it is like passive, that means fluid is flowing and particle is conceptually moving with that. So, in that way particles velocity and flow velocity are the same. So, this at a given location. So, when this particle comes at x1 x2 x3, at that location you have its velocity as u1. So, similarly when it comes to its this x2 x1 x2 x3, its y component of velocity becomes u2 and its z component of velocity becomes u3. This u1, u2 and u3 are Eulerian descriptions, but when the particle is coinciding at that point, Eulerian and Lagrangian descriptions are merging. That is the basic concept. So, now because you are mixing up the Eulerian and Lagrangian, instead of this one we will use the capital D dt, because we are describing it through Eulerian variable. So, if you are writing that one, so we can just isolate this operator and write d dt of anything here, this phi. So, u1 so this is one type of term and you also have that another type of term which is time independent. Okay. So, this is what is clearly the unsteady component, that means at a given location you have this phi variable changing with time. Okay. And this is what is the so called convective component, that means there is a change in position, at a new position there is a change. So, this is convective and this is that inflow minus outflow. Okay. So, if you now look into these terms mathematically, it is just like summation of ui I equal to 1 to 3, right. So, now because many such expressions come in continuum mechanics, there is a shorthand way of writing it, where you write the same thing, but you just do not write the summation. So, you just write ui this one. How do you know that there is a summation? There is a repeated index. So, this I as an index is there because it is repeated, you have this invisible summation. This was introduced by Einstein. So, this is known as Einstein's index notation. So, that means now you look into the slide. So, you have the local component, or this is the unsteady component, and the convective component, which is ui into this one. So, basically there are 3 terms because you have the repeated index I, and because it is a repeated index, it is dummy, because you could write j, k, l, etc., but there is a summation over it. So, what index you write does not matter, you can give it any name. So, now if you come to your conservation principle expressed mathematically, so what we are doing is, if you see the left hand side, so now you have ddt of this phi per unit volume times dV. So, what we are doing is we are writing this in terms of dV into that the entire change. So, if you are looking in the right hand side, what you are doing is, so if you look into that capital ddt of dV, what is this? What this is physically talking about? It is physically talking about that if you have a volume element, whether the volume of the volume element is changing with time. If that changes, in a fluid mechanics terminology, we call that as compressible flow. If that volume element does not change its volume with time, we say it is incompressible flow. So, that capital ddt of dV is equal to 0 for incompressible flow, but for compressible flow that is not 0. So, just to make you alert, there is a difference between incompressible and flow and incompressible fluid. So, when you are talking about incompressible flow, you are talking about this kinematics, that means there is a volume, that volume does not change with time, it does not talk about any property, whereas the incompressible fluid is talking about the property density, and whether that density is a function, strong function of pressure or not. Density could also be a function of temperature, but you have many problems where the fluid behaves like incompressible, but density changes with temperature just because of effect like thermal stratification. That means you have light fluid which is at the top and heavy fluid at the bottom. So, in that way, here we are talking about not incompressible fluid, but incompressible flow. So, incompressible flow will have the no change of dV with time, and compressible flow will have change in dV over time, and the change in the volume over time is given by this one. This is basically the divergence of the velocity vector, partial derivative of uj with respect to xj. So, how, if you are not familiar, I am just trying to clarify that notation. So, divergence of the velocity, this is physically the rate of change of volume of this dV per unit volume per unit time. So, the divergence of this one, this is basically you have the, I am just writing with x, y, z and maybe I, j, k as the unit vectors, because from school level you have been following that. And the velocity vector which I was talking about, u1, u2, u3, in many elementary textbooks that is written as u, v, w, all the same, it is just some name you give. So, ui plus vj plus wk. In our index notation, we will change x to x1, y to x2 and z to x3. That is the index we will use. Sometimes index is quite convenient, because in the computer code you can just write for the summation of for loop, and in that way very easily you can code this whatever is there. So, u1 I plus u2 j plus u3 k, right. So, now if you take the dot product, so you will have simply this. So, you can in the index notation write it as this one. Okay. So, that is what is written there. So, now if you use the product rule for the two terms, these two terms together, this is how what you can write together. So, the net change, you have this first term and the second term, which is just the combination of this. Remember, the right hand side was integral of psi dv. So, left hand side was integral of what is written in that equation dv, and right hand side is integral of psi dv. So, left hand side minus right hand side will be something. So, you will have this d phi dt plus phi into this one minus psi, this integral of dv, this is equal to 0, right. Now, this you are taking with respect to some arbitrary control volume, right. Why we are talking about control volume? Because our variables are all Eulerian. Okay. So, because the control volume is arbitrary, and so imagine that you have an integral of fx dx equal to 0. So, you could have one special case or some special cases where fx is not equal to 0, but its integral is 0. Like if you have a definite integral of sine function over its entire cycle. So, that integral is 0, the periodic full period, the periodic function's integral is 0, total area is 0, but that does not mean the function is locally everywhere 0. But if you have the volume arbitrary, then you have this thing in the square bracket equal to 0, and that is what is leading to this equation. So, this is the what you can say is the transport equation. Okay. The phi is something which is it can be just any variable, you have to describe it physically properly, and one interesting thing is that you can switch off or switch these from one to the other. This is the differential form. You can use its corresponding integral form. So, simply what you do is you integrate it over the volume, because you have got this equal to 0 by this integral. So, this is 0, therefore, this integral dv is also 0, right. So, if you want to get it back, you can again integrate and get it back, and then you can also use one thing, that if you have divergence of some function over a volume, you can write that vector f as, or that integral effectively as an integral over an area A. This is Gauss divergence theorem. Okay. So, you can replace the divergence, which is the special change, with respect to the area integral, where this n is a unit vector normal to that area dA, and this area is the entire contour which bounds the volume. So, physically this is what is your inflow minus outflow of the particular property, and that is reflected by the divergence. So, they are equivalent. So, you have an inflow and you have an outflow, their difference is leading to a spatial change from one point to the other, okay, and mathematically it directly follows from the divergence theorem. So, that is what is given there, and in that way we are in a position to describe all the physical laws with this mathematical framework, where you have this a time derivative plus a spatial derivative, and you have a right hand side something. Okay. So, whatever is the right hand side you are having is this psi. So, this is generation. Now, when we are talking about this mass is defined as density times the volume. So, when you have mass conservation, if you are thinking about a packet of mass, that if you see that pink colored small element, that is like a packet of mass, say it has a density rho and volume dV. So, its mass is rho into dV, and as it is moving and described by Eulerian coordinate about its velocity etc., its total derivative of mass is 0. That means, mass is neither getting created nor destroyed. And this is the law of conservation of mass. Of course, this is not valid when you have the mass energy interconversion, but such relativistic things we are not going to talk about here. So, if you now write that, so this is equal to 0. So, that is the Lagrangian way of looking into it, that you have a control mass, that control mass's mass is not changing. Right hand side the Eulerian, with the green color I have written Eulerian. So, that now you are describing with the help of two types of derivatives, one is partial derivative with respect to time and partial derivative with respect to position. These are the respectively the temporal and the convective components. Temporal means time dependent. So, in that way, if you are now writing this, recall that I will go back to this one. So, your expression in the box whatever is written. So, if you now replace small phi equal to rho, the density, then you recall that in the conservation of mass, your overall mass is for the volume dV is rho into dV. So, when we are symbolically expressing something as phi into dV, then phi becomes rho, right. So, if you put phi equal to rho and take it on one side and then put psi equal to 0, so you will have this one. So, this is what you will get. This is your continuity equation, conservation of mass. So, you can write its differential or integral form. So, differential form I have just written, and you can integrate it over the volume and convert the volume integral to area integral using the Gauss divergence theorem. So, you can write either way. Similarly, just like mass, you can write about momentum. Momentum is mass into velocity, right. So, what you can do is you can just write ddt of mv is equal to f, that is Newton's second law. So, we are writing that material description. So, ddt of m is rho into dv, and velocity we are just writing one component, jth component. So, uj, right hand side is the force along the jth direction. You can write instead of ji. So, in the next sentence or the next step, just to make you familiar that it does not matter, whatever is the direction, left hand side j will have right hand side j, left hand side you write I. So, right hand side will be I. So, that is what we have written, and once you do the same thing as you did for the mass and recognize that your change of this dV over time is nothing but the divergence of the velocity. So, if you combine that, you will get what is called as momentum equation. So, this is linear momentum. So, you have Fi, which is the total force, and the left hand side, if you see that rho into u. So, rho into u is m into u divided by volume, right. So, that means you are writing everything per unit volume, left hand side. So, right hand side will also be per unit volume to have the consistency in dimension. So, right hand side, that F is per unit volume force. So, when you have a force, now you could have two types of forces. One is a force which is distributed throughout the body, that is called as a body force. So, if you have force body force Fi, so that is force per unit, you can write it force per unit, not volume, it is per unit mass. Okay. So, total force then is rho into Fi into dV. So, per unit volume it becomes rho Fi dV divided by dV. So, that is rho Fi. So, if you are writing it per unit mass, it is rho into Fi, if you are writing it per unit volume, it is just Fi, depending on what you are writing. And then the other thing is that you are writing it. So, this is the body force. The surface force is described in the form of a stress. So, it is the divergence of the stress tensor, and tensor is because it is having two indices for its specification. So, the stress which is acting on a surface at a point, it has two indices to describe. One index, say I. So, sigma has two indices. I will just clean it off. So, you have sigma I j. So, this I represents the direction normal of the area. So, you have an area. So, the area has a normal direction. So, that is this I, and this is the direction of the force. So, if you change the direction of the normal at a given point, the force will change, because the area orientation will change. So, force will not just depend on where you are calculating it, but when you are calculating it per unit area, how the area is oriented, and that is why the orientation of the area is through the index I. So, if you have such a description, I can be from 1 to 3 and j also can be from 1 to 3. So, if you are writing it in a matrix form, you can write 3 by 3 matrix. Otherwise, it is called as a second order tensor, because it requires two indices for its specification. Now, there are two types. One is that if the fluid was at rest, then also there would be some stress, and that stress is due to pressure of the fluid. That is called as a hydrostatic stress. So, if the fluid is at rest, then the only stress is normal stress. A fluid at rest cannot have shear stress. So, when it is at rest and it is with normal stress, the pressure is what? Pressure is always inward to the area, and the normal stress by sign convention, tensile stress is positive. So, that is why that minus P is what it represents, the normal stress, and when it is normal, it is not just normal stress, but it is normal stress even if the fluid was at rest. If the fluid is moving, then also it has pressure, that is also normal, and on the top of that you can have another force or another stress which is due to the deformation of the fluid, and that is there when the fluid is moving. So, the change of that with respect to position is giving rise to a force. So, this D is it is called as deviatory component. That means that it is related to the deformation of the fluid, whereas P is not related to the deformation of the fluid. So, the two things are decoupled and that gives rise to this conservation of momentum. So, you have the mass into acceleration equal to total force. Force is one due to the hydrostatic component, another is due to the deviatory component, plus you can also have body force, and this entire thing you can integrate over the volume and write an integral form. So, what is important as a lesson we have learned, it is not exactly term by term, because you can well understand that this is not a fluid mechanics class. So, I am trying to give a recapitulated overview, because usually each of these topics we spend hours in a normal fluid mechanics class, but we do not have such a scope in a short focused application oriented course. So, the whole idea that I want to convey to you, that be it mass, be it momentum or be it anything else, we are able to write it in a form where you have the mathematical structure very similar. Now, just because fluid flow has stress due to the deformation. So, to calculate the deformation, what you require is the gradients of velocity components. So, if you have a velocity component, its different gradients will give you different derivatives will give you different aspects of deformation. Like this is an example of unidirectional flow, that means fluid is flowing along the x1 direction, but any variation in the velocity is only along x2. This is called as unidirectional flow. This is strictly not one dimensional, although we call it one dimensional, because it depends, the entire thing has description given by two coordinates x1 and x2. U is in the direction of x1 and its change is along x2. So, it is the better terminology is unidirectional, although mathematically it is one dimensional. So, now we can calculate different gradients, and this particular derivative which is shown here, it is talking about the rate of shear strain. So, just to give you an idea that what physically it is meaning. So, you have a stress versus strain relationship which is called as constitutive relationship, and this is where all fluids are different. In the previous lecture we were talking about blood or several other different types of fluids. So, up to what we discussed in the previous slide, there is no difference. It is the general description of stress, but how stress is related to deformation, that is where different fluids are different. So, if there is a fluid for which the stress is linearly proportional to the rate of strain, and that proportionality constant is a constant, it does not change with any change in orientation of the coordinate axis, that means it is isotropic, and also it does not change from one point to another, that means it is homogeneous. Then with a single property viscosity you can describe the relationship. So, in that way you can write this one, the deviatory stress component, and this minus 1/3 is coming because the second term you can see it is related to the divergence of the velocity vector, the partial derivative of uk with respect to xk. So, when you have a strain, there is a strain due to change in angle, but there is a strain also due to change in volume. So, the second term is related to the change in volume, and it is a normal strain. So, all what it means is that when you have normal direction, then only the strain is occurring, because volumetric strain is normal, it is not tangential. So, that is manipulated by this delta ij, which is there in the last equation. So, this is called as Kronecker delta. So, delta ij is equal to 1 if j equal to I and is 0 if j not equal to I. So, what it is trying to do, it is trying to switch the case from the normal direction to the shear direction, normal direction I equal to j, so that becomes 1, and shear direction 0. So, that you are writing a term which will automatically be 0 when it is a shear direction. that minus 1/3 comes from the fact that there is a volumetric deformation coefficient just like viscosity, another property of the material, and that and mu are related. In that way the volumetric deformation coefficient lambda is equal to minus 2/3 mu. This all derivation you can see in the derivation of Navier-Stokes equation in any of the full lectures. You can see my lectures in NPTEL and you can see that. I am not going through that because the objective is not really that, but the objective is to show that how you are in a position to derive a governing equation for the parameters of your choice and how mathematically they look all the same. So, now if we substitute all these in the right hand side, and for constant viscosity we can make a jugglery of this one. So, the last term that I have written. So, if you have something so let us say you want to calculate this partial derivative. So, you can always write this one if the partial derivative is continuous. So, you can switch the order, and if you have an incompressible flow, this is 0, divergence of the velocity. So, incompressible flow this term is not there, but compressible flow this term will be there. So, accordingly you have the Navier-Stokes equation where some extra terms are there due to compressibility and otherwise it is incompressible. In the topics that we will be covering as a part of this course, we will be mostly dealing with incompressible flow. So, in that way you will have that term equal to 0. So, now we will not get into the derivations of all sorts of equations. What we can understand here, that whatever may be the equation, whatever may be the conservation law, you can write it in the general conservative form. So, you have an unsteady term, you have an advection, advection is like the convective component moving with the flow. So, it is the divergence of something, then you have something which is the diffusion, like for viscosity, for viscous flow the viscosity is like the origin of diffusion. For a heat transfer problem, heat conduction is the origin of diffusion. So, physics may be completely different, but just by changing the values of this phi and the gamma, which is the so called diffusion coefficient, you can see that you can retrieve many equations. If you put phi equal to 1 and gamma equal to 0, it is the continuity equation, conservation of mass. Phi equal to u and gamma equal to mu, you get the x momentum. That means the Newton's second law along the x direction. If you write phi equal to v and gamma equal to mu, you get y momentum and w z momentum. And if you write phi equal to T, which is the temperature, and gamma is K by Cp, where K is the thermal conductivity and Cp is the specific heat at constant pressure, and you have these additional terms which is related to heat generation, the viscous heating effect, that means because of viscous friction between different fluid layers there is an internal heating. So, with all those coming into the source term, you can get the energy equation. So, in that way it is possible to get all the equations back if we are able to derive it in this conservative form. The central message therefore is that if we now know how to numerically simulate this and get results out of computer simulations, then that is what will give us a control of not just solving all these equations, but any other equation which can be cast in this form. So, I will just conclude with one example. The objective is not to show that how this example is actually solved, but to give you an idea that you may have a wide variety of equations describing a physical problem which is very important for human health, and how the mathematical knowledge of solving such equations can help us to address this problem. So, this is a physical problem where the most lethal stage of cancer comes when the cancer at its origin it is there. So, you can see that if you look into these figures, the second figure in the left, you will see that there are, you can see some black spots. So, that is the primary tumor. So, a tumor is growing there and there is a blood vessel which is drawn, like you can see that black lines, and then these yellowish layers, they are endothelial cells that I talked about earlier. So, this tumor when it is growing, so the blood vessel is as it is normal. Now, when the tumor is growing, it requires nutrients because it has to grow abnormally. So, where from it will get nutrients? It is still there in a extracellular matrix. So, it has to get the nutrient supply. So, it can only get the nutrient supply by having a blood vessel which will give it a supply. If it does not get that supply, the tumor remains as it is, but it does not become catastrophic. So, you will see that many people are having tumors or maybe very early stage cancers, but it does not become catastrophic. Only if they know, they will become, of course, mentally disturbed, but it is not disturbing the health as such. Now, a situation may come when this tumor wants to not really grow abnormally, but it wants to just proliferate and get into other parts of the body. Now, that means its growth and its nutrition demand is huge. So, then it gives a message to the blood vessel that, see, I require something more for my abnormal growth. So, there is a chemical, you can say a biochemical signal which is called as growth factor. So, this growth factor, this is it is symbolically mentioned as VEGF. So, it sends a message to the blood vessel. So, how it sends the message to the blood vessel? At the tumor, the growth factor's concentration is very high, and at the blood vessel it is 0. So, there is a concentration gradient. So, there is a diffusion. By that diffusion, the message is sent. When this message is available, the blood vessel will respond to that by making some holes at its surface and making the endothelial cells moving out and creating a sprout, and then new blood vessels are formed, and that new blood vessel will join the tumor, and this is known as angiogenesis, that is dynamic formation of new blood vessels. It can form in many other physiological conditions, but cancer is one such very critical condition, because then you can easily recognize that these cancer cells now have a path. They can move using those new blood vessels to the main bloodstream, and then they can move and create a new cancer at a different location. So, you will see that maybe cancer chemotherapy is going on and it is people are getting cured, say maybe it is some cancer in the lower part of the body, but suddenly you find there is brain metastasis, that means the cancer has affected the brain. So, this is how it happens. Now, therefore, the role of the growth factor in developing this is very important. So, there is no such fundamental physical law which tells how the growth factor would change with time, or how the endothelial cells will come in and go out, but what can be done is that you can imagine these small blood vessels as some microfluidic channels, and that blue colored region in the physical system is like a porous medium, and they are connected by some channel like system. So, this is what we mean as mathematical model. So, right hand side is an idealized simplified depiction of such a complex thing, and with the boundary condition and the governing equations for fluid flow and mass conservation, the continuity that we talked about, we can get the velocity and pressure. And then what we can do is we use two different equations, and these are bit of, you can say, heuristic equations. That means these are not, you cannot really fundamentally derive that, because there will be some coefficients which will be talking about the diffusion and then the generation, depletion, etc. in a chemical environment. So, in a chemical environment there is diffusion, something is created, something is depleted. So, all those things are there with two variables, n for the endothelial cell density, number density per unit volume, and p for the growth factor. So, in that way we can have coupled differential equations, but these can also be put. In that way, sorry, not p, c. So, you have two different species, one is the endothelial cell and another is the growth factor, for which you can solve two different convection diffusion problems, and then couple that with your solution of the Navier-Stokes equation, and you will get an idea that depending on how the extracellular structure is there, then what is the density of endothelial cells. That means that over time how much endothelial cell is coming out of the main blood vessel and creating that the connectivity between the blood vessel and the tumor. So, such a complex problem you can get hold of this by representing it in terms of some mathematical equations which are like the transport equations, that is convection, diffusion, generation, like that, and then you are in a position to solve the problem. This may not give you the exact clue of what is happening, but it will give you at least some insight that what are the factors which are playing a role in such a situation. So, to summarize what we have discussed today, we have talked about the general transport and conservation. We have tried to see that irrespective of completely different physics, how all these things can be generalized in the form of similar format of differential equations, which can either be expressed like differential equation or integral equation, and then solution of those equations numerically, which is the CFD part, can give us a handle on how to solve such a very complex problem and get a physical feel of the outcome. So, from the next lecture we will try to see that given this template differential equation, how can we develop the understanding of a method, a computational method which we can apply to solve such template equations by using computer simulations, and that is what we will start with in the next. Thank you.